Okay, welcome to part two, which is the context of my L2 poetry class. So very quickly, um, I titled the class Writing as Communication, Second Language Creative Writing. It's a communication skills class, which is an elective class. So um, it is not a required course. It's also open to all students, not only English majors, but any university student can take it. Most of the students are fairly low to low intermediate, which is very common in my EFL context. The class size from semester to semester will range between 5 and 15 students. We meet once a week for 90 minutes. It was face-to-face before, but last semester was in Zoom, and this semester, which will be starting in April, will be kind of a hybrid, depending on what happens with the pandemic. So yes, and I focus specifically on poetry in my L2 creative writing course, and we use a reading to writing cycle developed by Spiro. And we also use Hanauer's meaningful literacy as a framework. So the poems I'm going to use are taken from 3 semesters worth of literary journals, which we publish at the end of every semester. And here they are. The journal's called Seasons, an EFL literary journal. And it's just basically a collection of the best writing from that semester. And we also use these journals as the textbooks for later semesters. Textbooks, and also really they act as model texts, where second language writers read other second language writers' poetry. So this breaks down any fear that the writers may have in comparing their work to native speakers, because they're reading other second language writers, and often the students know each other. It acts as a good kind of conduit as we move between semesters, because it also links the cohorts together, right? You have the people from 2020 reading, or people from 2022 reading spring 2020, and they're linked together because they use these poems as model texts, which they also comment on. So it links the cohorts and it gives life to cohorts past. Okay, so I'm going to claim now that second language writing, and specifically second language poetry, is an excellent genre or venue for efficacious L1 in L2 practices in second language writing. Poetry is a great place to do translingual writing, multilingual writing. Okay. One, because it does not follow academic conventions necessarily. If you're not writing in a form, then there's not necessarily any conventions. And we do shin haiku, which is a type of haiku, but without the 5-7-5 syllables, and free verse. So I have completely taken off any conventions. And of course, it doesn't follow like academic writing conventions or anything like that. The second part of my claim is that students are given poetic license. Okay, they can make their own artistic choices from various rhetorical, compositional, linguistic, sociocultural, anything that they have, they can use. So that includes multilingual practices, translingual practices. And this is the idea of adaptive transfer, how it's it's not just using something and reusing it again, but based on what is happening in students' perceptions and experience, transfer happens in different ways in each text. Okay, and the third one here, L2 writers can sometimes lack familiarity with genre expectations, but free verse doesn't really have very many conventions. So writers have the freedom to express themselves using any cognitive resources or experience that they may have. Okay, so Kanagaraja in 2020 in Reconciling Translingualism Made a list of statements that I have slightly adapted only by adding the word can in front. Everything else is directly from Kanagaraja. These can-do statements you will see throughout this video poster presentation. And they're just ways of checking, it almost like you would use a rubric to see how your student's writing is kind of adding up to these translingual practices and multilingual practices that he speaks of. Okay, so the first one, students can utilize multi-voiced and genre-bending practices that accommodate narrative, personal, or other rhetorical preferences from the student's background. So bending genres or using multi-voices, multilingual voices for narrative or personal or rhetorical uses. Number two, they can find scope for creativity using grammar or rhetoric in their English writing. So we will see some uses of creative grammar and rhetorical practices. Three, they negotiate established norms. Maybe this is more for academic writing, but working outside the box or think outside the box. And number four, student being these translingual and multilingual repertoires to their practices. So we'll look at some examples of this throughout. Okay, so you'll see that slide again. All right, finally, we'll look at these examples of my students' L2 poetry, looking at linguistic concepts such as code meshing and code switching, rhetorical concepts such as onomatopoeia, which is when a word sounds like what it is, like zip or bzz, okay, like a bug. Style choices and choices of topic are some rhetorical concepts, and also some composition concepts that are translingual or multilingual, such as employing Japanese forms, such as haiku in English free verse poetry. All right, thank you for sticking around for part two. Let's go to part three, which will be translingual writing and multilingual writing concepts. We'll look at some of my students' poems. All right, so goodbye and see you in part three. Thank you.